All right, welcome everyone. Glad to have you all here today. Let's go ahead and start. I guess I will lead the prayers. I'm not sure if anyone else is here to do that. So we can get the prayers online. Is There we go. Cynthia has started the prayers for us. Great, thank you. So again, this is just our refuge and bodhicitta prayer. I think most of you are familiar with it. But we have kind of those two ideas within this, finding refuge or some sort of safe direction in the Buddha's teachings. And for some of you, you may be relatively new to Buddhism. That's okay. You can just kind of recite or listen to this as we recite it. But then the second two lines have to do with this motivation of bodhicitta. We're actually going to talk about this a little bit today, as well as do a short meditation on it after we do this prayer. So we're going to recite it in English the first time, and then we'll do it twice, chanting the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened. To the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sonam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho. Okay, that was an interesting touch. Okay. All right, let's do a short meditation. I always like to start with a little bit of meditation so that we come into this space and let go of whatever distractions we might have on our minds, preoccupations, what have you. And we'll do a few minutes of focusing on the breath to do that. And then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for our time together today. So in terms of meditation, I think most of you probably know how to meditate, but if you don't, essentially just find a nice upright posture where the back is somewhat straight, but relax into this posture as best as you can. You can keep the eyelids slightly open if that's comfortable for you. If not, you're welcome to close the eyes. We're just going to focus on the breath, and there are a couple of ways to do this. If you're new to meditation, I might suggest working with the sensation around the nostrils, where you feel the air coming in and out. As you inhale, as you exhale, there's that very subtle sensation that occurs there. You just want to tune into that as best as you can and try to keep your awareness there. But check in occasionally, and if you've lost your awareness of the breath, then simply let go of whatever distracted you and guide the mind back to the breath. So again, we're going to do a few minutes in silence, just meditating on the breath as best as we can, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection. So I'll ring the chime here in the Gompa to start the meditation. So now to set our motivation, we are calling this course 8 Steps to a Happy Life. I thought it might be useful to just do some reflection on what does it mean to have a happy life? If you look at your own life right now, we use this term happiness a lot in our culture, but do you have a happy life? And if you do, well, what are the causes of that? What are the things that bring you happiness? Maybe just do a short investigation there. And certainly if you find that you don't have a happy life, well, then what do you think would help you to have a happy life? Spend a few minutes just kind of focusing on this idea of a happy life. If you have it, what brings it to you? If you don't have it, what do you think is missing? What do you think would help you to have a happy life? And I'd like to put forward the idea that our happiness at its deepest level comes from having purpose and meaning in our lives, from being in accord with how things are, living one's life imbued with some level of wisdom and understanding, and living life with a good intention, a good motivation, a desire to benefit others, to be a force of good and peace in our world. And this is what we're going to be exploring in this course, the Buddha's path to attaining true happiness, to having a happy life as we pursue a deeper form of happiness and well-being that we all can attain. So as we set our motivation for being here, let it be informed by that idea that we are here with some desire to have a happy life ourselves, to find a deeper state of being that is rich, meaningful, purposeful. But we do that with the aim of helping others to have the same, recognizing that we are not sort of standing on our own, completely independent of others. Rather, we are in a world of interdependence. I want to be here to work on ourselves, to develop a deeper understanding of the Buddha's teachings, so we can help others to find deeper meaning and purpose in their lives, to find the happy life that they seek as well. So just try to hold this motivation. Always try to be here to work on ourselves so we can be more equipped, more capable to benefit others. And then open your eyes gradually and take a moment to come back into this space. Again, welcome everyone this is the first of the next 2 Sundays after today, 3 Sundays in total. We're going to work with this course that I taught for the first time for Thupten Norberling back in 2014. I was looking through my notes and I taught it over 8 sessions. I didn't realize it took me quite as much time. And I used 1 session for each of these 8 steps. So it's going to be a little more consolidated, if you will, but I think we'll be able to touch on the richness of these teachings of the Eightfold Noble Path. And when we talk about happiness, as we did in that motivation, that meditation that I led you in, obviously in Buddhism, we're not talking about a happiness that is contingent upon things external to us. We tend to do that in our culture and in our lives, right? We get certain things that bring us some measure of happiness, pleasure, what have you. But those things, of course, are fleeting and temporary. They're not really something that we can depend upon. They're not reliable sources of happiness. As we're going to be exploring in this course, the Buddha teaches that our way of finding true happiness is within ourselves, within our own minds. And these are some of the topics we're going to be exploring even to some degree today already. I want to introduce you to this whole idea of the Eightfold Path. And I might mention, by the way, that I do have a handout that I've made available. If you go to the center's website page for this course, you will find a link to that handout. Let me go ahead and put that on the screen just so I can share it with you. Oh, I do need to have screen sharing enabled, Cynthia. Thank you for doing that. So again, this is just a little handout that consolidates these 8 points. I think when I taught it the first time, I had a separate page for each of these 8. But again, you're getting everything that you'll need in terms of kind of developing an understanding of these. To begin with, I might mention that, again, the teachings of the Buddha, we can divide into kind of 2 primary paths, if you will, 2 main directions that the Buddha taught. The first one was to give us an ability to attain kind of happiness for ourselves. To develop some freedom, some liberation from everything that is currently causing us to be not in a state of well-being. And then we also learn the path of the Mahayana, the kind of more universal path that is about kind of taking those teachings and applying them to the situation of all other beings and kind of generating an awareness of the universality of our situation. So again, this is what's going to be set out in terms of these teachings do tend to come from that first set of teachings, what's often referred to historically as kind of the Hinayana. The Hinayana are the teachings that do, again, mainly focus on our own individual liberation, our own well-being. But we're going to universalize it because this is a Mahayana center. These are Mahayana practices. We want to take a look at them in the context of our larger goal. So this is the handout that I put together, and I'm indebted to whoever on the internet put this nice little diagram together. Many of you are familiar with this shape. This is the Dharma chakra, the wheel of the Dharma. It has 8 spokes to it, and the 8 spokes represent the Eightfold Path that we're going to be looking at. They've done a nice little color coding of this, and I try to stay true to that in my slides and in my presentation. We're going to be starting today with the ones that are in yellow here, right view and right intention, which are essentially teachings of wisdom. We're going to start with the wisdom teachings because we have to have some context for everything else that the Buddha presents. We have to understand the Buddhist view, the view or understanding that we need to have, and then the intention we develop on the basis of that. In next week's class, we're going to try to focus on the green section there. Moving in a clockwise direction, we'll go through right speech, right action, and right livelihood. These are an external component of our being in terms of how we relate to others, speaking to them, our physical actions, and so on, even how we gain our livelihood. That will be an important component in terms of our morality. Buddhism does teach morality that's grounded in an understanding of karma and so on. We'll look a little bit at that today, but next week we'll go into more detail about how we move through the various practices that reinforce Buddhist thinking in terms of our actions in the world. And then the last class, 2 weeks from today, we'll go through the ones that mainly support our practice of concentration, meditation. These are right effort, right mindfulness, right meditation or concentration itself. These 3 that are in purple there are kind of the underpinning for what we need to do to develop very deep meditative practice so that we can actually change our minds in a much more lasting way. We can do some of this practice with an understanding and sort of a more general approach to things, but we have to go much deeper if we're really going to have the changes that we would like to see in our lives and in our minds. So essentially what we're going to be looking at then in this course is this idea of these 8 as they're set out in terms of 3 different areas, 3 different areas of focus that we can take a look at and work with. And I'm going to try to keep it very practical. Of course, Buddhism is meant to be practical. We're going to go into some philosophy and theory and what have you as part of this. But the whole idea is how do we take these teachings and then use them in our everyday life? So let me go ahead and start with a little bit of a slideshow that I put together for today. And I won't go through all of these slides right now. I've got a number of them. I want to start with a quote from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Because what we're studying here essentially is the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. What is the purpose of the Dharma? Just like other spiritual traditions, Buddha Dharma is an instrument for training the mind, something we use to try to work out the problems that we all experience, problems that originate mainly at the mental level. So this is what I was encouraging you in the meditation today, is to look at, when we talk about these sources of happiness, I'm kind of proposing, and the Buddha proposes, that the sources of happiness as well as the sources of suffering or discontent come from within our own minds. They come from within ourselves. We like to point the finger and blame everything outside of ourselves, or when we have happiness, attribute that happiness to things outside of ourselves. But what we're really looking for in terms of Buddhist practice is to work with our minds, to actually change our minds so we can find deeper levels of well-being. In fact, what we mean by happiness in Buddhism is finding these deep states of flourishing that we can accomplish through internal practice. This is really the happiness that we are seeking, not the fleeting, temporary experiences of happiness that we have in our lives. Continuing with this quote from the Dalai Lama, he says, negative emotional forces create mental unrest, such as unhappiness, fear, doubt, frustration, and so forth. These negative mental states then cause us to engage in negative activities, which in turn bring us more problems and more suffering. This is, again, the Buddhist view. All of the problems and difficulties we have come from negative states of mind. Those negative states of mind produce their effects more immediately, but then they also cause us to engage in actions and behavior that cause suffering to others, that cause us to have future suffering. This is something we'll be looking at again in a little more detail as we go through today's teaching. So practicing Dharma, he says, is a way of working out these problems, be they long-term or immediate. In other words, Dharma protects us from unwanted suffering. In fact, the word Dharma itself literally means that which holds us back or protects us from suffering. All that the Buddha taught is Dharma, is some means, some mechanism for being able to keep us from having to experience suffering. I want to mention this topic of the Noble Eightfold Path and put it in a little bit of context. We don't really study this topic as much in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. However, it is presented in a wonderful set of teachings that I explored when I did my studies at the master's program in Italy, called the 37 Harmonies with Enlightenment. And many of you might be familiar with this. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's 7 different categories of phenomena that are involved in kind of creating some level of enlightenment or liberation. And the last of these, the last grouping, are the Noble Eightfold Path. They are really set out by the Buddha as one of the main means by which we can accomplish the goals that the Buddha sets out. Of course, the Buddha sets out more temporary goals. The Buddha says that our lives are not the only life that we've ever had. We've had countless lives before this one. We are going to have more lives in the future. The very first level of the Buddha's teachings are to kind of help us to have a good rebirth, what's often called a higher status, to make sure that we end up in a state of existence that is comparable to this one, that is as rich as this one is in terms of the opportunity we have to work with the Buddha's teachings. That's the very first level of what the Buddha gave us, was some mechanism by which we can have an effect while we are going from life to life so that we have better conditions. But then he went on to teach this idea of what's called definite goodness, which is a state where we can be certain to attain some well-being that will last. It's not well-being that we have for a while and then it goes away. It's well-being that is certain to be there forever. And we have kind of 2 different goals within that. We have the goal of liberation, an individual freedom from our own situation, from all the negative tendencies His Holiness was talking about. And then we have enlightenment, which is in this tradition framed as complete Buddhahood, as a potential of our minds to, bring it to that fullness, that richness of having, being imbued with all the perfect qualities that we need to benefit other beings. So the Buddhist path, again, is tended to be laying out in terms of those 2 orientations. We have what will lead us to a good rebirth or what will lead us to something that is more final. And within what is more final, we have the 2 orientations of the traditional teachings that take us to our own liberation, as well as the Mahayana teachings, this rich set of teachings that take us to attaining the state of Buddhahood. All of these teachings go back to the very first teaching the Buddha gave. the teaching on the Four Noble Truths. And I want to do just a little, I'm not going to recite the whole Four Noble Truths Sutra. I want to just go through this very beginning part, what's on the screen here. This is what the Buddha gave as his very first teaching after having attained enlightenment. It's the core teachings of all of Buddhism, whether we talk about Mahayana Buddhism and that being Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, whatever, all those kinds of in that branch, or whether we talk about the Hinayana path, which includes the Theravadan tradition now in Thailand and Burma, what's now Myanmar, all of these countries that are very rich in that tradition. Essentially, this is where it all started. The Buddha, after attaining enlightenment, deciding that this is how he would frame his whole kind of insight, everything that he learned through his spiritual path, through his investigation. So it starts off with these wonderful words that all sutras pretty much start out with, "Thus have I heard." On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Varanasi in the Deer Park near Isipatana. Of course, this is somebody writing down, scribing these teachings after they have already happened. There, the Blessed One, the Buddha, addressed the monks of the group of five thus. These are the five monks that he practiced with, engaged in all these very deep meditative practices. Those practitioners were there gathered, and he gave them the very first teaching he gave. "Monks, these two extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness. What two? The pursuit of sensual happiness and sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, unbeneficial, and the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, unbeneficial." So there's kind of two ways that the Buddha saw that we are going to be futile in trying to find true happiness. One is what he had before he left on his spiritual journey when he was Prince Siddhartha. That was the kind of self-indulgence, having all the worldly pleasures that you could desire at your feet. It only leads to kind of like they use this analogy of drinking salt water to quench your thirst. It doesn't lead to a satisfaction of what you're looking for. It just feeds your endless desire. The other one was self-mortification that he also practiced with these five monks. These deep practices of kind of denying the body and trying to achieve some form of moksha or liberation through these deep ascetic practices. Self-mortification and self-indulgence do not lead to the path. You have to find a middle way. So he went on to say then, without veering toward either of these extremes, the Tathagata has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, and leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to what they call in the Sanskrit tradition, nibbana, which is nirvana in the, it's in the Sanskrit. This is the Pali tradition, nibbana. And what, monks, is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, which leads to nirvana? It is this Noble Eightfold Path. That is right view, right intention, again, which we're going to talk about today, that encompass the wisdom aspect, right speech, right action, right livelihood, again, the morality we'll look at next week, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, which apply to developing deep meditative stabilization. This, monks, is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge and leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nirvana. So again, this is the idea behind what we're looking at in this course, and it does have its grounding in the very first words that the Buddha uttered. So it's kind of nice to go back to this. I always like teaching this in a Mahayana context because, once more, we don't tend to have teachings on it that frequently. We tend to take a look at it as part of our teachings. By no means do we skirt over these teachings, but they're not detailed in the way that we are, looking at this presentation. So that's a little bit of an introduction to that. Let me go back to my slides and we'll move forward and get into the actual material for today. This is, again, just an overview. This is from the first page of the handout that I put together for you, just detailing where these three are located. So again, although the practice of all three higher trainings do influence each other, they're often seen as forming a hierarchy, with each built upon the preceding as follows. So we're going to be kind of changing the order, and I'm going to explain why we do that. The basis, the foundation for all Buddhist practice is morality. It's kind of interesting. Again, when I grew up Catholic, and of course there were many precepts of being a good Catholic and what that entailed. All spiritual traditions have some form of morality, right? Morality in the theistic traditions is based on the view of that creator God and the rules and regulations set by that creator God. Whereas in Buddhism, there is no creator God. It's a non-theistic tradition. The understanding and underpinning for morality, as we're going to see next week, is the law of karma, the law of cause and effect, and understanding that we have to face the consequences of the actions that we engage in. Therefore, we need good morality for our own sake, as well as for the sake of not harming other beings. So that's the foundational teaching that we often see in our presentation of how we look at the three groups of teachings in the Eightfold Path. Concentration is built on the basis of morality. If you don't have good morality, you can't develop deep concentration. I mean, those of you who do engage in meditation, what is your mind like if you've just had an argument with somebody and you try to sit down and focus the mind? It just doesn't work, right? Because anytime we have a disturbance to our minds in regard to our behavior, it doesn't create a good foundation for developing deeper meditative stabilization. So we need to have good morality in order to practice deep concentration. And in order to really have penetrative wisdom, we need to have deep concentration. So wisdom actually comes last in this presentation, but today we're going to look at wisdom first. As I said, I'll explain why that happens. A wonderful book on the Eightfold Path by Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's an amazing practitioner. I think he's British originally. He's been spending a lot of time in Asia, but he's done an amazing job of translating so much of the Pali Canon into English. He says, perplexity sometimes arises over an apparent inconsistency in the arrangement of the path factors and the threefold training. Wisdom, which includes what we're going to talk about today, right view and right intention, is the last stage in the threefold training. Again, as we saw in that previous slide. Yet its factors are placed at the beginning of the path rather than at its end, as might be expected according to the canon of strict consistency. I mean, it would seem like if I was going to teach it according to the way that it is taught here, I would start with morality and then go on to concentration next week and then to wisdom. But I'm not doing that. Why am I not doing that? Well, Bhikkhu Bodhi explains it. He says, the sequence of the path factors, however, is not the result of a careless slip, but is determined by an important logistical consideration, namely that right view and right intention of a preliminary type are called for at the outset as the spur for entering the threefold training. In other words, and I think this is really true. If every one of us, who's been involved in Buddhism for some time, if you look back on your own path, you needed some introduction of some preliminary wisdom for you to even set out on the path, right? You need to have some understanding of the Buddhist view. What does Buddha's understanding of the world and what is going on in our world and the nature of our world, what does that look like before you can even move forward? And of course, you have to have some intention that drives all of that, some sort of underpinning of why you want to engage in all of that. That's based on your understanding. But you can't really engage in good Buddhist practice without that understanding. So if I were to come in and just start talking about Buddhist morality without an understanding of the Buddhist worldview, it's very hard to kind of engage in it. So that's the reason why we're going to be looking at them in this order, starting with the wisdom aspects today. So right view, this is continuing from Bhikkhu Bodhi, provides the perspective for practice. Right intention, the sense of direction. So again, we have to have that right view or understanding. It gives us a perspective for what we're doing in Buddhist practice. This is what we're going to focus on mainly today, but also how that feeds into a right intention or a right thought that gives us sort of a sense of direction. What is it we're trying to do with our spiritual practice? But the two do not expire in this preparatory or preliminary role. For when the mind has been refined by the training in moral discipline, we're going to look at that again next week, and then concentration in the final class, it arrives at a superior right view and right intention, which now form the proper training in the higher wisdom. So it doesn't stop. And in fact, we can even say that these continue to feed into each other. The more we develop deeper practice of morality, the greater our concentration becomes, the greater our insight into wisdom. The more that our behavior is informed by that wisdom, the greater our morality strengthens, and so on. It all becomes very, very circular. From another wonderful book about the Eightfold Path that I'll be quoting from here and there by Bhante Henepala Gunaratana, practitioner of the Thai forest tradition. He says, though I have presented the Buddhist path as a series of sequential stages, it actually works more like a spiral. Morality, concentration, and wisdom reinforce and deepen each other. Each of the 8 steps on the path deepens and reinforces the others. As you begin to practice the path as a whole, each step unfolds, and each wholesome action or insight gives impetus to the next. So hopefully this is something we can see as we go through this course as well, is how everything kind of feeds in a spiral, deepening our practice, bringing us to more and greater understanding and practice as we move forward. As we move forward. This is also, I think, I don't know if I have that in your handout, but this is something that I got from the internet, and I'm indebted to the person who put this together. These eightfold factors that go around again in a clockwise circle. He's got them here in this spiral idea that it continues to feed one into the other. Wisdom, or again, it's called pana in the Pali tradition, feeding into our morality, shila, and then from shila into shamatha, concentration. And so again, these continue to move in a spiral and to increase our practice and our understanding of the Buddha's teachings. So, okay. So then Bhante Hanapola Gunaratana says, along the way, everything about you changes, especially your tendency to blame others for your unhappiness. With each turn of the spiral, you accept more responsibility for your intentional thoughts, words, and deeds. So this is, again, what we're mainly looking at in terms of the Buddhist path, is that everything becomes more and more inward focused. As we practice Buddhism deeper and deeper, we tend to rely less and less on the external factors. And we develop a peace that allows us to navigate the external factors. Many of you can speak to this in terms of your own, experience. And that's what the richness of Buddhism is that the Buddha set out these teachings for us to try them on and to see what kind of results we gain from them. And if you don't find the results are happening for you over time with the Buddha's teachings, well, then you're welcome to try something else, of course. But the Buddha's path is very much one about using everything that the Buddha taught to increase our inner awareness so that we can, again, navigate whatever life throws at us, be it situations that are happy and delightful or situations that are horrible and miserable, to be able to maintain peace of mind and to deepen that peace over time so that we can eventually attain more lasting peace. In what's called the state of nirvana, nibbana, this idea of having pacified all the factors in our minds that are destructive for us and for others, and having completely fulfilled all of the positive qualities that we need to be able to be of great benefit to other beings. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Let me get into the first one. Again, this is the first set of 2. If you look at once more, let me put the handout there just so you have some orientation on that. You're all welcome to, again, go to the website for the center. And this is the first page. I already went through some of this. It's been repeated on the slides. We're going to move now into the second page where we talk about right view or understanding. So this word's right view or understanding, again, you have always different translation equivalents. When you're dealing with anything in another language, whether it be the Pali tradition that came out of the Hinayana teachings or the Sanskrit tradition that came out of the Mahayana teachings, you're always going to have different translation terms. It's just what happens in English, right? So right view or understanding, this really gets at kind of our initial entryway into the Buddhist teachings. Every one of us has come to the Buddhist teachings and found something in them that kind of sparked some insight, if you will, deepen some idea of kind of what the Buddha's framework is for looking at the world that we are in and the situation that we find ourselves in. And this is really, once more, often the starting point for our Buddhist path. We have to have some preliminary understanding of what it is that the Buddha is teaching at the very core level. And again, most of that is set out in that very first discourse that I read the passage from, the teachings on the Four Noble Truths. We're going to look at the Four Noble Truths as one of the main teachings that gives us an understanding of exactly what the Buddha was saying in terms of our situation and the situation of all beings. So let's introduce this topic of wisdom to begin with. We can certainly say that we have 4 different types of wisdom that the Buddha often emphasizes. The first one we don't talk about quite so much, but because we're dealing with a continuity of lives in Buddhism, we do have wisdom we've accumulated in previous lives. Every one of us comes forward into our lives with what we've accumulated in our previous lives. If we've developed some insight, some wisdom, that's carried forward. That's the wonderful thing about using this life well, is anything we do in this life, which is the next 3, will go forward into our next life. This is the continuity of our path that will eventually deepen our wisdom to an even greater degree. The three that I want to touch on really briefly that are at the bottom of the screen, though, this is how we go about developing wisdom. Wisdom always starts with some initial hearing or reading of the Buddha's teachings. None of us, were introduced to Buddhism just on our own. We didn't come up with an idea sitting on a mountaintop somewhere, and suddenly that idea, was given to us in terms of some sort of self-conceived thought. We always receive the teachings from another. We receive the teachings in a format like this, where somebody is giving us these teachings orally, or we receive them in terms of, reading a book or accessing other information that is available now in our modern age, where we have so many ways of accessing information. The second step is we have to think about these teachings. And even what I'm going to give you as a form of homework at the ends of each of these topics is a way of kind of working with them, meditating on them, actually kind of investigating these teachings to see if they're true for yourself. Remember, that's how the Buddha himself said that his teachings should be worked with, not as kind of something really precious and wonderful because the Buddha taught them. We see them as precious and wonderful because we ourselves begin to see how wonderful they are, how much they really do make sense for ourselves. That's the second step. We have to contemplate and even discuss the teachings with others. Wisdom arisen from meditation is when we do have deeper concentration. Again, we're going to talk about concentration 2 weeks from today. We can and do have the complete capability of making our minds extremely focused through deep meditation. When we have that, we can make our wisdom much more profound and have greater effects from that. So let's go on to talk about right view or understanding, the first of these, which once more is that starting point. Lama Yeshe, who's the founder of our organization, he and Lama Zopa Rinpoche kind of began the organization 50 years ago last year. So the organization's been around for a while, and it was all started by these two amazing teachers. Lama Yeshe, I think this book might even be available out in the hallway there, I'm not sure. Freedom Through Understanding. Buddhism isn't some fanatical religious trip. It's a philosophical way of living life. And also, to study Buddhism, you don't need to believe in something extreme. It's a matter of investigating, examining, and experimenting on yourself. It's not just belief. Without understanding, or again, view, as we sometimes call this first of the Eightfold Path, belief can be very dangerous. Just believing in something might get you a little ways on the path, but that has to be grounded in some form of reasoning and understanding. And that's what I found personally when I came to Tibetan Buddhism about 33 years ago now. Hard to believe it's been that long. Doesn't feel like it's been that long. But, that was one of the initial things that really comforted me. I grew up again in a Catholic tradition where I was asked to believe in a lot of things. It didn't make sense to me. I'm not putting that tradition down. It just didn't work for me. But coming to the Buddhist teachings, it's all about understanding. It's all about finding what works for you. And do the teachings actually make sense for you? Are they logical? So again, belief on its own can actually be very dangerous. What Lord Buddha emphasized was that understanding is the path to liberation. Knowledge is the path to liberation. Thus, Buddhism emphasizes understanding. Understanding is the path. No understanding, no path to liberation. It is important to be able to differentiate, His Holiness says, between two levels of understanding. While we're talking about understanding, let's kind of get into this as a little bit of what Bhikkhu Bodhi was saying earlier. One is a superficial intellectual level where on the basis of reading, studying, or listening to teachings, we distinguish between negative and positive qualities of mind. We recognize their nature and their origin. We begin to understand the mechanics of our mind and how to work with them. Everything starts with some level of superficial or intellectual knowledge. That's kind of how things get in initially. When we start talking about wisdom, we're talking about really seeing things clearly, seeing things as they are. And we have to begin by understanding what the Buddha said about that. Again, what I'm moving into today in terms of this first topic is to get what are the things that the Buddha taught conventionally in terms of an understanding of the world and how things operate, and what is even the teaching at a deeper level. But it all starts with some form of superficial understanding or knowledge. That's how everything begins. We kind of get it and start to develop some awareness of it just by bringing it into our minds through hearing teachings, through reading books, what have you. Then he goes on to say, the other is the deeper experiential level where we actually cultivate and generate positive qualities within ourselves. In fact, even in the Buddha's teachings, we often talk about these two kind of awarenesses of what we mean by the Dharma. The Dharma, in some sense, are the sort of scriptures and the written words that we can begin to understand, but we have to make them experiential. We have to actually bring these teachings deeply into our hearts and into our lives. So that's, again, the challenge, the goal that we face as we, move through these teachings is to make sure that they don't just sit on the surface as something that we develop some understanding of, but that we have a deeper experiential understanding that actually does cause us to change our lives and change our minds and find the happiness that we seek. Although it can be challenging to develop an intellectual understanding of certain topics, it's generally easier because it can be cultivated merely by reading texts or listening to teachings, whereas to develop more experiential understanding can be challenging. Experiential understanding is far more difficult to develop since it comes about only as a result of sustained practice. At the experiential level, your understanding is also accompanied by a strong component of feeling. Your understanding is essentially a felt experience. I mean, hopefully some of you have had some taste of that. I know our Venerable Shanka has been leading people in gaining an experiential awareness of the Lam Rim. All of the teachings we teach at this center are about some experience. You have to go from just a thought about it, an idea about it, into how do we actually experience these teachings. And that's the challenge. All three of these trainings support us in doing that. But it starts with having to develop some awareness, some understanding, and then we can deepen that understanding through the other practices and eventually through our deepest meditation. So this is, again, where we're embarking on in terms of this topic of wisdom and kind of how we can develop it. Now we're moving into the main topics that are on the handout for you, and these are the things I want to spend at least a bit of time on today. Having correct view, and by the way, this word correct or right, some people take an aversion to this idea of something being right or correct. Maybe another way of phrasing this is skillful or mindful. I mean, a skillful view, a skillful understanding means that we are actually working with understanding that will lead us in a direction that is fruitful. Again, the Buddha had no problem referring to it as right or correct because this is in the Buddha's view what is right or correct. We have to see this for ourselves again, not just believe in its correctness or rightness. But if it's easier for you to work with the idea of more skillful view, that's perfectly fine to have in your mind as we go through this. So again, these are the topics that we're going to be looking at. The first two are mind and karma. These two are very much intertwined, and I want to talk about them together. Mind, in terms of mind, we have to understand its nature and its potential for true happiness, something I've already touched on a little bit, but I want to go into a little more detail. The second thing is karma, which is the law of cause and effect, and its relevance, its applicability to achieving happiness. So essentially what the Buddha teaches is that at the core of our being is what we call mind. Mind is not a physical phenomenon. Mind in Buddhism is non-material. It has the aspect of knowing, of experience. Mind is experience. You cannot have experience without mind. We've had mind because mind depends upon prior moments of mind to exist. We've had our mind since beginningless time. The Buddha doesn't say there's a beginning to when mind came into existence. Our minds have always been here, going through different iterations, different existences on the basis of the principle of karma. And that principle continues to move us through this life and will continue to move us through future lives. So mind and karma are very much involved because karma is created at the level of mind. As we're going to see next week, we're also going to touch on how our minds in our physical embodiment and in the world end up interacting with others through our speech, through our physical behavior, through our employment, our livelihood, what we do for a living. All of these are ways that we have a manifestation of our mind in the world, but everything starts at mind. You don't just start saying things without mind being involved, nor do you do things in the world without your mind being somehow involved in that process. Everything begins with what we mean by mind. Now, mind, again, is a vast topic, and I don't have the time to give it due justice, but our minds are essentially a product of what we have done with our minds. Our minds can become very habituated to what will lead to unfavorable circumstances, but they can also become habituated to what will lead to what is most fortunate. The whole Buddhist path is one of identifying what are the positive states of mind that will lead us to greater well-being, that are more skillful, if you will, and having that understanding of what then will produce the causes of happiness. And what are those things we need to abandon? What are the things that are not fruitful, that are not leading to our well-being, that are causing us problems in the moment, but also causing us problems in the future? The principle of karma is how we see that playing out. What we do with our minds essentially creates our future experiences. There's a wonderful quote that I'm going to share on the screen now from the Dhammapada. The Dhammapada is a set of sayings of the Buddha. It's used much more in the Pali tradition, though there is a Tibetan version of it. This is the very first two verses of the Dhammapada, and they speak to so much of what the Buddha was teaching in terms of the Buddhist view of where happiness and suffering come from. He says, all experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted mind, and suffering follows, as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. So the wagon is always being led by the ox. So too, our suffering follows after our minds. If we have actions that we engage in through our speech, through our behavior, and so on, again, what we're going to look at next week, that are coming from what's called here a corrupted mind or a negative state of mind, which includes primarily these minds that are, we can see the danger of minds like anger and jealousy and so on in our worlds. But even things like kind of desirous attachment, our tendency to grasp and crave for those things that are pleasant, that drives so much of what's going on in our world. All of these things are negative states of mind that are only going to lead to future suffering. They're only going to cause us to have to experience what is painful and difficult, because that's how karma works, and that's how our minds work. What we do with our minds causes various results to follow. Just like, again, the ox pulling the wagon wheel. The wagon wheel is going to go in the direction of wherever the ox is going. So again, that's the first verse in terms of what is negative or unwholesome leading to suffering. It's a very basic principle. It's not moralistic in any sense. It's not a justification. It's just a simple explanation that what we do with our minds that is negative will lead to suffering. Now, you'll notice the similarity of this second verse in the Dhammapada. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows, like a never departing shadow. Looks like your shadow follows you everywhere you go in the sunlight, what have you. It never leaves you, right? So too, that happiness never leaves you if you move in the direction of having a peaceful mind, having a mind that is working with correct understanding, skillful understanding, and engaging in actions on the basis of that. So what I love about the Buddha's teachings is it all boils down to some very basic principles. In fact, one of the what I had on the screen earlier of the 37 harmonies, one of them in terms of correct abandonings has to do with four main thoughts, two of them pertaining to the positive states of mind, and two of them pertaining to the negative states of mind. The Buddha gave us the basic advice that what we are to do to affect causes of happiness for ourselves is to create any positive states of mind that we haven't yet created, and those that we have created, to develop them and deepen them, make them very much a part of our lives. And then in terms of the negative states of mind, we are to not create any negative states of mind we haven't created, and those that we do deal with and are struggling with, to diminish and eliminate them. That's the entire Buddhist path in a nutshell. It's all like good psychology. Of course, in Western psychology versus Buddhist psychology, you have different delineations of what are entailed in positive emotions and negative emotions. But essentially, if you study what the Buddha teaches in terms of the mind, that's what it boils down to in its essence. Our job as Buddhists is to work continually with our minds so that we can have an effect, not just on our own future experiences, which is where it starts, but to also realize that how we are in the world and the effects we have on others come from our states of mind. That when we engage in more unskillful actions on the basis of a corrupted mind, a negative state of mind, then we are invariably going to harm other beings. And if we are more peaceful in our minds and going about our lives with greater love and compassion for other beings, we're going to do a lot less harm to others as well. And of course, developing our minds to the greatest degree to becoming a Buddha, a fully enlightened being, entails those two aspects, completely eliminating what is negative and completely developing to a limitless degree what is positive. And we all have that potential. That was the other thing that was on the screen just a short while ago, the mind and its potential. We all have this potential. Essentially, in the Mahayana tradition, we call this Buddha nature. Every one of us has, just by virtue of having a mind, the potential to do that work, to completely eliminate what is negative and develop these unbelievable positive qualities. And we have these amazing examples in our world of beings who kind of embody that for us, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who seems to have, again, an amazing sense of being and never any sort of anger in his mind. He's talked many times about what's happened to the Tibetan people in occupied Tibet, but never with any real anger. He might be developing, at times some kind of stern stance on that this should stop and that Tibet should go back to an autonomous country. But he doesn't want, start bombing the people in China and what have you because of them taking over his homeland. I mean, he essentially understands that those states of mind are not going to produce positive results. So we have beings that embody that kind of way of going about practicing, but it's all rooted in those two main concepts, mind and karma. Through mind, we create, through the vehicle of karma, our future experiences. It's our choice. That's what I also liked about the Buddhist teachings when I first met them, was that it had nothing to do with any being outside of me. The Buddha is outside of us, but the Buddha is simply giving us the instruction that we ourselves have to practice. It's up to every one of us to say, okay, these teachings make sense to me. I'm going to engage in them to some degree, come to understand them and live my life by them and see what results we get. Venerable Rabina, who many of you know, she often emphasizes that idea that all these teachings, belief really shouldn't enter into the picture so much, just like Lama Yeshe was saying, right? It's not just about belief. It's about developing kind of an experiential taste for these teachings through you being the experimenter. Venerable Rabina uses the phrase working hypothesis. Use these teachings as a working hypothesis, just like you're a scientist. You say, okay, this is how I want to approach an understanding of how I'm going to live my life and see what effects you get. How do you feel internally when you live your life according to these principles? How are others around you as you become more peaceful? What sorts of results do you see further down the pike? Of course, karma is a huge topic. I could talk about karma all day, but that's not, again, why we're here today. But we do have to have some understanding of those two principles of what the nature of mind is. Mind is this non-material phenomenon that has this continuity, which makes it very workable, right? We can change our minds. What we can do from this point on is to move our minds in a much different direction. And that's through the force of karma, this law of cause and effect, which, by the way, is really just a subset of what we see in cause and effect in our world. We have great confidence there, right? We all know how to affect things in our physical world to get the results that we seek. Like I always use the example of a vegetable garden. Here we are moving into the warmer months in New Mexico, and you can actually grow vegetables if you do what's necessary to do that. You don't just sit there and look at your plot of land and wish that the vegetables would grow. You have to go out there and work the soil. You have to remove the rocks and the weeds and everything else, make the soil more fertile, and then plant the seeds and make sure that they're nurtured and cared for, watered, and so on, so that you actually get your vegetables. It's the same thing in our Buddhist practice. Spiritual practice is no different. If you want particular results, you have to create the causes. If you want to continue to experience a variety of results with no real reason to it, well, then you do that. But if you actually pay attention to what we're doing in terms of what seeds we're planting, then you actually get the results that you seek. And that's the whole principle of karma as it plays out, very similar to the way that we see things in our physical world. So those are the first two topics that I want to give you some understanding or view of. A little bit to wrap this up from once more Bhante Henepala Gunaratana. He says, you alone are the author of your future. Experience teaches you that. Your behavior is not an unchangeable law of nature. At every moment, you have the opportunity to change, to alter your thoughts, your speech, your actions. This, again, was one of the most precious gifts that the Buddha gave us, was this understanding that everything is workable. Our situation is always workable. Even in the worst possible moments of our lives, you still can work with your mind if you have the strength of mind to do that, obviously, but you have that choice. You have that ability. This is what we're working on developing in our minds. If you train yourself to be mindful of what you do and ask yourself whether it's likely to lead to positive results or negative, you'll be guiding yourself in the right direction. I think we all have this kind of inner knowledge. One of the things that Buddhism often highlights is the idea that we have sort of within us our own sort of inner gurus or inner teachers. at the deepest level of our being is some wisdom that we can access that is in harmony with how everything is. We just live with so much discord and not being in touch with that. These external guides like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, like these amazing teachers that we do have, that we can be influenced by, they give us some awakening of that, some understanding of that. But the external guides or gurus are only there to waken up our own internal wisdom and compassion, our own inner guru. So that's the best way to relate to all those beings, is to understand that their job is to kind of hold up a mirror that we can then look at and go, I need to do that work. I need to go move in that direction. But I think we have that within ourselves. We do know what's right and wrong and what will lead to more positive results and what will lead to negative results. Is to be more attentive, more aware. And that is part of our path as well, is to enrich that inner guru and that inner understanding so that we can move forward on our path. A second topic after mind and karma, again, I lump those two together. A second thing that I want to spend some time on, and I won't be able to do this justice in the time that I have, but hopefully most of you have some understanding of this very basic teaching. Again, the first teaching the Buddha gave in that sutra that I quoted from briefly earlier, the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha's observation on why we suffer and how we attain happiness. By the way, this word noble that we also use in the Noble Eightfold Path, it means those beings who have some nobility in terms of their understanding. You can develop this deeper understanding that is informed by your meditation, that will allow you to become what's called a noble or Arya being, a being who has that deep insight. This came from the Buddha's understanding, these noble truths that he saw. The very first one we often do refer to as the truth of suffering. I put in parentheses there the word dukkha, though. Dukkha is a Sanskrit word, and it's very similar in the Pali. But this is kind of bigger than what we often refer to as suffering in our culture. Because the word suffering often really just refers to something that we can see as the tip of the iceberg of what the Buddha taught is unsatisfactory. Suffering in our culture means aging and illness and being parted from the things that we like and having to die and having to face things that we don't like and having to be kind of thwarted in obtaining our desires and all these various things that go on in our everyday life, right? The pains, the agonies, the anguish, all of that is certainly a part of our situation. And it's what we often refer to as suffering in our culture, but it's once more the tip of the iceberg. By dukkha, the Buddha said we are in a fundamentally flawed situation. We are under the control of factors that are leading us to only experience things that are contaminated and not capable of producing lasting peace or happiness. We all have the potential for that, but in the patterns that we have been engaging in and the things that we have been doing, we have not yet found that for ourselves. Essentially, the Buddha said, he said, this very first type of dukkha is very evident and obvious. You could call it the dukkha of pain or manifest dukkha. It's something that we can actually see very easily. And it's often a starting point for our awareness of our situation. That when we do get really ill or we do have some loss in our lives, some grief we experience, we might wake up to some understanding that things are not okay. There's something wrong with the world. The second level, though, is the fact that we have some change in even our positive experiences. This is often called the dukkha of change. Even all the positive things that you've experienced in your life, and think about them, you can think about them briefly right now. All the things that maybe even in the meditation today that you thought about and said, the things that have produced happiness for me. Some of those experiences that we have that do produce happiness for us in our conditioned world don't really produce deep, lasting happiness. They come and they go. As I mentioned earlier, they're fleeting, they're transitory. And in fact, if we were try to sustain those, to produce deeper and more long-lasting happiness, they wouldn't lead to that. They'd actually lead to pain. Let me use the example that Lama Tsongkhapa uses, and my teacher in Italy would use it frequently. And when I was studying in Italy, we were about, 10 miles away from the Mediterranean. And so when the weather warmed up, everyone would want to go down to the beach, right? And even though we don't have a beach here in Santa Fe, you know what it's like to go to the beach, right? And say it's a kind of a bit of a warm day, but there's a breeze, maybe a bit like what today is, except perhaps a bit warmer than what it is out there today here in Santa Fe. So you're looking forward to going to the beach, right? And by the time you get down to the beach, you're kind of warm from just the whole journey and everything. And so you can't wait to get into the water to cool down. And you cool down and then you get a little cold in the water, especially if there's wind, you start getting goosebumps. And so then you go back out into the sun. so you can warm up again, right? And you lay in the sun for a while till you get too warm, and then you go back in the water and you cool down, and then you get too cool in the water and you go back to the sunlight and you get warm again, but you get too hot and you go back in the water. This is what we call having fun at the beach, right? Is it really fun? Is it really happiness? What the Buddha would say is once you arrive and you start to get into the water, you start the suffering of being in the water. It feels like pleasure because you're so hot from arriving at the beach and everything it took you to get there that it feels like happiness. But it doesn't lead to real happiness. And the longer you stay in the water, again, the colder you get. So then you start getting cold, you go out in the sun. Now you're starting the suffering of being in the sun. But it doesn't feel like suffering when you first get in the sun because it feels good in relation to the coldness of the water. So this is, again, the patterns that we play out throughout our lives. And look at when we have hunger and we want to eat, we start the suffering of eating. You can't keep eating and get more happiness out of eating. It doesn't happen, right? We learned that when we were young, sat down to eat and filled our mouths with piece after piece of pizza or something, and we just got an upset stomach. This is what happens. You don't really get greater happiness by engaging in those forms of pleasure, if you will, happiness. They actually change. They don't lead to any real solution to the problem. Now, we do those things, and there's nothing wrong with doing those things, but have that understanding. Again, this whole topic is right understanding. How do we look at those things? If we look at those things as kind of final solutions, if we fill our lives with all sorts of external stuff and we use this rule of moderation, I'm going to do this for a while and then I'm going to go on to this before this becomes painful, then I'm going to go on to this before that becomes painful. We just kind of live our lives continually pursuing all these things. It really won't lead to any real peace or happiness that's lasting. That's the trick. And that's what the Buddha's path is teaching us, is that you actually can have lasting peace and happiness. This second level of dukkha is saying, don't look for that in the habitual ways you've been looking for it because it doesn't exist there. Those things that bring you pleasure or happiness in this life are not going to do the trick. The third one, the third level of dukkha, is the bigger picture, that we are in this situation all the time of being under the control of our karma, our deluded states of mind. We are never going to know any true peace and happiness until we're free from this once and for all. Essentially, in that first noble truth, it's a truth of dukkha or suffering, but it's also spelling out the truth of how we can have happiness, because we have to be free of all the factors that keep us in this unsatisfactory condition, this unsatisfactory state. And of course, that leads us to the question of the second noble truth. Well, okay, if this is a situation that we're in, that we're fundamentally in a conditioned existence that's never going to produce happiness, we can see the obvious suffering, we can see even the suffering or the unsatisfactory nature of what's pleasant. Well, then what are the causes of that? This is the second truth that the Buddha taught, was that the causes of our dukkha or this state of dissatisfaction are within our own minds. The same things I was pointing out earlier. Those deluded, afflicted states of mind that don't lead to real peace or happiness. They disturb our minds. And we can, of course, be free of those. And the karma that we create on the basis of that is a part of the equation as well. So we have two fundamental causes of our dukkha: our karma and, of course, our afflictions, our deluded states of mind. Again, this would be a whole course in and of itself looking at the Four Noble Truths, but I'm going to keep moving through these because the third of the Noble Truths is the kind of the good news the Buddha taught. Okay, if this is our situation, we're dealing with an unsatisfactory situation that is caused by things in our own minds and our behavior, our karma on the basis of that. Well, guess what, folks? It can be ended once and for all. There can be a cessation of that. Venerable Rabina, when she teaches on this, she says the Buddha should have taught that one first. and maybe there's some logic to that, right? But I think we have to get the depths of our own situation first. Again, going back to how this is right view or understanding, you have to see that this is your situation. Start there. Don't be looking at others and saying, oh, this is what they're all going through. This is what I am going through. I'm in an unsatisfactory situation. It's caused by my own crazy, deluded mind. And the karma I create on the basis of that. Therefore, because the Buddha says that I can have an end to all of that, I can be free of all of that, that leads to, of course, the fourth truth. Well, how do I get there? And that's where the Buddha also taught the Eightfold Path. It's kind of interesting. It's a bit circular, but essentially, this teaching is where he set out the 8 factors that are necessary for us to attain an end to our dukkha. And that's, again, might be at the initial level of just our own liberation, our own freedom, but we can go beyond that. We can also even attain a state of Buddhahood where, again, we can help others to achieve the freedom that they seek. So essentially, I'm just going to go back and point out really quickly on that Four Noble Truths Sutra that I had up there earlier. Let's see, let me pull this down so I can put that up there. This is, again, the full sutra. He went on to say, if you go to that paragraph that's just underneath the blue passage there, now this, monks, is the noble truth of suffering, or dukkha. Again, he went on to talk about that. Then the next paragraph, the noble truth of the origin of dukkha. Then the next one, the noble truth of the cessation of dukkha. And then, now this, monks, is the noble truth of the way, the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. It is this Noble Eightfold Path. Once more, the 8 factors that I touched on earlier. So it all comes right back around again, that how do you actually attain liberation or enlightenment? By practicing these factors. And it all starts with a correct understanding of what the situation is that we are in. If we get that clearly, that we are dealing with the truth of this dukkha, this unsatisfactory situation that is caused by factors in our own minds, then we know the solution. Because the Buddha says there is a solution, and the Buddha gives us the kind of instructions for achieving that solution, well, then we have some confidence in engaging in that. This is, again, one of the most basic teachings that the Buddha gave, something that we all have to, again, spend some time becoming familiar with. Today, I'm just kind of scratching the surface of it, but nonetheless, know that there are, many, many teachings that support an understanding of these 4 noble truths. Everything the Buddha taught was based on this schema of the 4 noble truths. It's a beautiful structure for how to look at what we are dealing with now, the first 2, and what we could have if we actually engaged in something different, did something different. This is my little diagram I use for explaining how this is operating in our lives. And that's because I haven't really touched on this so much, but this is an important part of a view or an understanding the Buddha gave. If we go down to the very bottom of this tree of samsara, under the ground there, deep in our own minds, is this root of ignorance. Ignorance is clinging particularly to this I, this self, this person that we identify with, and all phenomena to be truly or inherently existent. Again, we're not going to touch on that quite so much in this course, but it means that we think that there is something real here that is the I, that there is something that is findable and identifiable and able to set itself up as our I, our self, our personhood. And this is the deepest truth that the Buddha taught, not an easy thing to understand. It's the final level of wisdom we want to generate. We'll come back around to touch on it after we've gone through the other 2 Sundays. At the tail end of that last Sunday, we're going to come back and kind of revisit this with some understanding of how we then address that fundamental problem. That has to be removed, just like those roots have to be completely uprooted in order for the tree to be, wiped away. In the meantime, though, we're dealing with the mechanism of the root of ignorance giving rise to the second factor there, the trunk of the tree, which includes both the wholesome and unwholesome thoughts that we cultivate. We do have good thoughts. Give yourself credit. You do have some thoughts of love and compassion and kindness in this world. Congratulations, right? But they're all still rooted in ignorance. So they're only going to produce results that are within the tree of samsara until we generate some deeper wisdom, some deeper understanding that will actually inform those behaviors and move them in a different direction. But we have a lot of unwholesome thoughts that we generate. Again, minds of anger, jealousy, greed, what have you. The branches, number 3, are the karma, the virtuous and non-virtuous actions we create with their respective thoughts. That starts at the level of mental, but it can also become verbal, physical. Those behaviors we engage in give rise to the 4th factor, the fruits. That's the happiness and suffering we experience from our karma, which are both included in dukkha, again, because even when we have happiness in this conditioned way, it's not true happiness. And that suffering is the unsatisfactory experiences that we have that are a part of our existence as well. Again, this is just one way I put it together to kind of give a flavor for it. As long as we have this root of ignorance, we're going to be kind of in what's called samsara. Samsara is a Sanskrit word which is referring to kind of the round of existence, the fact that we go from life to life, never really finding any real peace. So that's the idea of what the Buddha taught in the Four Noble Truths. I also want to touch on really briefly, as the final topic in this right view or understanding, what are called the Four Seals of Buddhism. In fact, there's a book, I meant to look up his name again. I can't remember his name. He's a wonderful Nyingma teacher. He says his book title is What Makes You Not a Buddhist? And essentially, you're not a Buddhist if you hold to something contrary to these four. And it's a really nice book because he goes into great depth about kind of an understanding of these four. The very first one, these four seals, or, kind of they stamp or seal something as being Buddhist. These are the axioms of all Buddhist traditions. The very first one is that everything that is created in our world through causes and conditions, what are called compounded phenomena, everything that is arising in that way is impermanent. Your own body is impermanent. One of the big things that we focus on often in our tradition, meditating on the impermanence of this body. Our minds are impermanent. The physical world around us is impermanent. Everything is constantly changing. Of course, the confusion we have is that we like to hold to things as if they weren't changing. We like to try to have some sort of static quality to things when in reality they are constantly moving forward, always changing. The second one, all of the contaminated phenomena, which are all the things that arise in the tree of samsara from the root of ignorance, all those things are in the nature of dukkha. They're in the nature of suffering because they're arising from a faulty root, from a poisonous root, if you will. In that way, we see through the examination of the Four Noble Truths, but they're embodied in this second seal of the Four Seals. Everything that arises contaminated from ignorance is in the nature of dukkha. Because once more, even the positive fruits that we get, the happiness experiences we have, as we saw when we looked at the first noble truth, those aren't satisfactory. They change. They're not capable of really being relied upon for true, lasting peace and happiness. The third one is referring to what is the antidote to that ignorance, the realization that all phenomena, and especially, again, the I, the self, are empty of this self-existence, empty of existing on their own, inherently, independently. That's the deepest level of wisdom we need to generate. And like I said, we'll come back around to that at the end. But already to have some understanding of these three things, everything that is created is impermanent. Everything that comes from ignorance is in the nature of dukkha. And then everything that exists doesn't have of this self-existence, this way of existing on its own. Now, the big problem, of course, is based on what we saw in that previous slide. We think that things do have that way of existing. It wouldn't be a problem if that was how they actually existed, but they don't exist that way. We're going about our lives with an incorrect view right from the get-go that we've had since beginningless time. We think ourselves and all phenomena exist in this very concrete, real way, and they don't exist that way. That's that third axiom, that third seal. Then the fourth one is the product of all of our understanding and practice, which is nirvana. This state that we can attain is true peace, is where you have pacified these factors in the mind. Okay, now I know I'm not doing these all justice in the limited time that I have, but let me just do a little wrap up of these with a quote from, once more, from Bhante Nepala Gunaratana. He says, realistic or wholesome perception, on the other hand, neither clings nor pushes away. It perceives impermanence as it is, dissatisfaction or dukkha as it is, and selflessness as it is. Those first three, again, that we saw in these three axioms. So again, if we are looking at things realistically, if we're having correct, skillful view and understanding, we don't cling and push away things. We embrace the impermanence of everything that exists that's conditioned. We embrace the unsatisfactory nature of things as what we have to work with. We don't keep banging our heads against the wall trying to get things to work out in samsara when they don't. And we see things as selfless. We come to understand through deeper investigation that things don't have that way of existing, that we've been believing in since beginningless time. So then he concludes, he says, when we perceive the world in a wholesome way, we cultivate wholesome thoughts. That's the whole gist of all this. It started off with me talking about how it all comes down to our mind and what we're doing in creating our experience. Well, if we have a wholesome understanding, a wholesome perception, then we have the wholesome thoughts that follow. And that's where we're going in the next topic that I'll only have time to touch on briefly. Realistic perception then is powerfully therapeutic. If we could see objects and people as they truly are, as impermanent, unsatisfactory, and selfless or soulless, nothing that we perceive could make us unhappy. Right? Our unhappiness comes from railing against these realities. If we really think about it, and this is an investigation you can do over the next week, to what degree are we buying into things and thinking about things as if they have some sort of permanent, unchanging qualities to them that we can find reliable, as trustworthy? The fact that they have that uncertainty, that they don't always bring about the results and that they can change, is something that causes us great pain in our lives. But if we accept that they change, if we accept that they're in the nature of being unsatisfactory, well, then we stop having these deluded conceptions in regard to them. We don't keep creating our own problems. That's the whole point of the Buddha's teachings, is not to exacerbate our own, problems and difficulties, but actually to find some peace and happiness with this understanding. And it all begins, again, with that topic. So over the next week, I've got, again, these slides will be posted on the same Google Drive that you have a link to at the website. Over the next week, find time each day to contemplate one or more of the points we've explored on right view. You can do this in formal meditation, or at least by spending several minutes in solitude examining them and reflecting upon their meaning to deepen your understanding. And as you do this, observe what questions or concerns surface and note them. These teachings are not easy if you're new to Buddhism to get your head around, but just take one of them. For example, take the teaching on impermanence. To what degree is impermanence reality? Investigate that. Is it true that everything is changing moment by moment, right? Everything constantly moving in that direction, never staying still for a single moment, even our own minds, right? And then what does an acceptance of impermanence look like for you? When you have that understanding, does it cause you to not grasp at things with some deluded idea that they're going to be unchanging, that they're going to kind of continue to provide what you're seeking? Or you can do the same thing with regard to dukkha, with things being unsatisfactory. Again, these are things you can work with. The next thing is I would also encourage you to do some sort of a mindfulness practice, if you will. During your day, bring to mind one or more of the points that we've covered, relating them to your ordinary experiences. See how they help reframe and influence the way you relate to the world and other sentient beings, and thereby increase your happiness and peace. Again, I know it's a tall order for just the first class, but begin to take what you're learning and apply it in your understanding as you go about living your life. What happens when you sit down to eat a delicious meal? To what degree is your mind being informed by wisdom and an understanding of the nature of that meal versus delusion, where you're just getting continually attached, like, a junkie attached to junk, all of that kind of mentality that we see playing out in regard to most of our sensory experiences. Try to bring some mindful awareness into your daily life. In the last few minutes I have, I'm just going to touch on this really briefly, but this isn't a huge topic, but it's big in terms of what it is the product of the previous one. If you have right understanding, then that informs what your intention is in this life, what your thoughts are that motivate you and guide you throughout your day. So having correct or skillful intention entails cultivating more wholesome attitudes and thoughts that are informed by your correct understanding or view. So we looked at in the previous topic how if we cultivate wholesome, positive states of mind, those lead to happiness. If we cultivate things that are askew and distorted and harming others through our behaviors on the basis of those thoughts, well, then obviously we're going to create more suffering. So having understood the causes of happiness and of suffering, making effort to change the mind, change our thoughts and intention. Again, that's the intention that arises. Once you kind of get the context of what the Buddha taught, your intention should be, I'm going to be my own therapist. I'm going to look at my mind continually and make better decisions about how I go about living my life. There are two more specific thoughts, though, that are also really emphasized that are part of our right intention. The first is renunciation. Renunciation is something we develop when we come to see very deeply the unsatisfactory nature of this life. That if we really get what the Buddha is teaching in that first noble truth, then we want to turn away from the second noble truth, the causes of that, and turn towards liberation, turn towards something that will be the better alternative to what we are currently experiencing. Which in a way, and Lama Yeshe often emphasized this, This means actually having genuine, compassionate concern for yourself. The Buddhist path is interesting. It definitely moves in the direction of compassion towards all beings, but it starts with compassion towards ourselves. If you can't have compassion towards yourselves, how can you have genuine compassion towards others? So all the teachings that we looked at initially, as I said, in the right view or understanding section of today, you initially see them in regard to me, myself, and I. You have to see that that is your situation and have some compassion for yourself. That means wanting something else for yourself, something better for yourself. Nothing wrong with that. Again, as long as you follow the path that leads to achieving that. And that's, again, what we already looked at in the Four Noble Truths. And what we're looking at throughout this 3 sessions is how do we engage in practices that support our greatest well-being. That's great. Start with compassion for yourself. Then you can extend compassion to others. Then you can generate the mind of bodhicitta, which is, again, the second state of mind that I'm emphasizing here. I'll skip over this little quote on renunciation and that part of it. Bodhicitta is the aspiration to attain enlightenment, Buddhahood, for the welfare of all sentient beings, which means enlarging your concern to include every being. This mind is especially rooted in cultivating great compassion and great love, which is essentially taking us kind of outside of our preoccupation with concern for just ourselves to wanting to engage in a more genuine concern for all beings. So again, this has got some more meditation and mindfulness advice. Maybe, again, I'll just put that out there. There are some wonderful practices in terms of mindfulness of bodhicitta that I haven't had time to touch on. Some of you are familiar with that. You can certainly practice that if you wish. But over the next week, too, if you do find some time, contemplate right view. And of course, this is the same. I think I miscopied this. Sorry, I didn't put that in there. I'll put that in the final version of it. When I was doing this yesterday, I think I copied in the wrong slide there. But you could meditate certainly on these ideas of renunciation, bodhicitta, kind of how do you have initially compassion for yourself? How do you start there and make sure that you have the mind that truly wants a different state of being for yourself? And then how do you enlarge on that to include others through having some awareness that they're in the same predicament that we ourselves are in? And therefore, we can have greater compassion, love for them, and so on. I know I've just kind of touched on some of these in the briefest of ways, but we'll kind of pick it up again a week from today. And I will touch back on this right view, or I'm sorry, right intention. Let me recap really quickly what we talked about. Again, we initially were just kind of introducing this idea of the Eightfold Path and kind of how it fits into the overall structure of the Buddha's teachings, how it can be condensed into these 3 trainings. Today, we were looking at the training in wisdom. More specifically, how we have, again, a right understanding of what the world is and what is going on. Something that, again, if you're new to Buddhism, might be quite eye-opening, like, oh, this is really what's happening. I'm under the control of these factors and experiencing this unsatisfactory situation, and it can be changed, and there's a path to do that. That can be, again, pretty mind-altering, pretty earth-shaking. But then the second one, having a right intention on the basis of that. If that is our understanding of what's going on, then we have to have the appropriate response to that. We have to move in the right direction. And that intention or direction is what we need to have guiding us throughout our daily life. So again, these teachings are very practical in terms of really trying to get us into the understanding that will help us to move forward and get the results that we seek. I want to see if there are any questions or comments. Let me check in the chat box just to see if there was anything there. Good. Someone, Suzanne put that in there. What makes you not a Buddhist is by Zongzar Jamyang Khyentse. Really interesting teacher. Yeah. Any comments or questions in the room? We do have a microphone, I think, for anyone who wants to ask. Yeah, Venerable Shanka's got that. Yeah. Anyone want to ask anything here? How about online? Anybody have anything they want to? Okay. Nothing? No questions? Everybody's been here an hour and a half. Sorry. Usually I try to end with some time for questions, but think about this. Again, I'm presenting this material. You will have access to some of this online that you can take a look at, the slides I presented, as well as some other information, again, on that handout. But do spend some time thinking about this, even if it's like while you're just walking around or something. I mean, you don't have to necessarily sit quietly and do a formal meditation. But just ask yourself, to what degree is this your view? And is this your understanding of, again, what will lead to a happy life? The Buddha says it's completely possible to attain an unbelievable state of well-being. But it first means we have to understand how what we're involved in is unsatisfactory. And then we can create the causes for the opposite and actually have that transformation occur. Okay. All right. Doesn't look like there are any questions. So let's go ahead and do our dedication prayers. If Cynthia, you could get those online and we will recite those together. Then I actually would like to beg everyone's just staying for another minute or so to recite a prayer for peace, for creating the causes for war to be abolished in this world, something that I think is very dear to all of us who are gathered here to get today. But let's go ahead and first begin by reciting this wonderful prayer from Master Shantideva that encapsulates this kind of bodhicitta spirit of us wanting all of our actions to have incredible benefit to all beings in these ways. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of our merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. We're going to recite this verse for the good health and long life and fulfillment of all the wishes of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And by extension, we can think of this in regard to all of our precious teachers who are still with us, as well as creating the causes for Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, for his reincarnation to be found very quickly, and for that being to be of incredible benefit in this world. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful, Tenrezik Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Okay, and then again, I'm going to put on the screen a little prayer. Oh, are we doing a mantra recitation? I wasn't sure. Okay, let me put on the screen a little prayer that we've been reciting on the Thursday morning prayers for our region. This is to pacify the danger of weapons, to remove the causes for war and so on. Begins with the recitation of the mantra of the Buddha of Compassion, Chenrezig. Om Mani Padme Hum, great loving victorious one, Arya sublime compassionate eye looking one, wrathful victorious Hayagriva, perfect pure Tara and so forth, objects of refuge whose holy names eliminate all dangers upon mere hearing, who are compassionate in nature, please pay attention to me. When the sentient beings of the time of quarreling and of flourishing of the 5 degenerations are tormented by fighting and intense suffering from the explosion of a great ocean of evil karma and jealousy, please dry this ocean up by the strength of your transcendental wisdom and compassion. Also, by letting fall a great nectar rain of loving kindness on the transmigrating beings whose hatred is a blazing fire, please grant your blessings for happiness and auspiciousness to increase by their recognizing each other as being like parents. Through your defeating the multitude of vicious evil spirits who by entering someone's mental continuum, change it instantly into the mind of an asura. From now on, may they never roam in this region. Please also cause all the sentient beings who have died in war from now on to abandon all evil karma, the cause and result, and be miraculously reborn in blissful land. Please also lead all others to that pure land. Please cause all those who are born and die to have long lives and not have sicknesses, to stop all their quarreling and fighting, and to enjoy a life in the 10 virtues. Please make rainfall at the right time, harvest to always be good, and auspiciousness to increase in all habitats and for all inhabitants. By the ultimate reality, that which is pure in nature, unbetraying cause and result, which has that ultimate reality, and the compassionate Guru, mind-sealed deity, and rare sublime ones, may my pure and extensive prayers be accomplished. As it says in the footnote there, that was translated from this prayer by Lama Zopa Rinpoche after the disasters in 9/11. So, and let's pray very strongly for peace in our world, for all of these minds of anger and hatred and violence to be tamed completely. And we do our work to tame our own minds so we don't contribute to that. So again, over the next week or so, try to work with these teachings as best as you can. Thank you all very much for coming today. Know that we do have our potluck lunch. I'll be joining for that as well. So you're welcome to stay. Even if you didn't bring any food, please stay. There's always plenty of food. We'd love to have you here as part of the community. So, all right. Thank you all online, especially thank you, Cynthia, for hosting and everyone here. Okay. Bye-bye.